Well, it's a mixed scene in Wales, as most people would understand. It's bad, but not necessarily as bad as people think. There are lots of bright sparks and encouragements, though everyone knows that church membership and involvement has declined sharply in Wales over the last 20, 30 years, probably more sharply than any other part of the United Kingdom, especially in the mainline denominations. But that masks the reality that when people share these statistical analysis of numerical decline and the closure of churches, that within all those figures, within the evangelical churches, the numbers are probably either holding steadily or just in very slow decline. And alongside the closure of many traditional churches, we're seeing the birth and the opening of a number of new evangelical causes across the country. While we've been here at the Welsh Leadership Forum, we've heard of the birth of new churches and fresh evangelistic initiatives across the board in many of the mainline denominations. Leaders have been here from Baptist, Apostolic, Presbyterian and Anglican churches, and all have acknowledged the steep decline in many of those churches in membership. But they've also, as evangelicals, highlighted the growth of churches that are focusing on the truth of the Bible, the gospel centered on the deity, death and resurrection of Jesus, and those who call for repentance and faith in Christ. And there are examples of small numbers of people turning to Christ in different places all across the country. Some groups like the Evangelical Movement of Wales have been involved for decades in camps ministries in the summer, which have been very fruitful. They've been involved in supporting lots of churches in evangelistic activities over the years. One of the striking things, in addition, however, during this conference we've heard, is of some fresh evangelistic initiatives taking place in a number of towns across the country, which it might be worth looking at. For example, today we heard about an initiative in Monmouth Baptist Church, an evangelical church on the border of Wales, and there is a congregation on average of about 80 people. They haven't done a full-blown week-long mission for many years, but early this year they had a 6-week effort in which they scrapped their midweek meetings, invited some speakers in to speak on bridge building themes. A cancer specialist was a professor in Oxford looking at the Bible and suffering in the midweek on a Wednesday night, and they linked that then with the Sunday morning, how Jesus dealt with suffering, for example in the life of Lazarus or the woman who had the hemorrhage with blood. So they were trying to link the midweek meeting with the Sunday meetings in order to provide a bridge to help people to cross the threshold into the church building itself, which is often a challenge as our culture is becoming more unchurched. And they did that over a period of 6 weeks. It wasn't exhausting for the congregation because what they did was to replace their normal midweek meetings with these public meetings. There was another talk on, for example, from Eve to Mary Magdalene, is there any good news for women? And we looked at how both women have been portrayed in Western art and compared that with how they're portrayed in the Bible, especially Mary Magdalene as the first person to see the resurrected Christ. And then on Sunday morning we had an evangelistic talk on the evidence for the resurrection. And we were amazed in that church with a congregation of 80, about 800 people came, mostly outsiders, through the use of social media, friendship, local newspaper, during the course of the 6 weeks. And they're planning a similar thing for the month of March next year. So there are a number of traditional approaches to evangelism which are employed, but also some fresh initiatives taking place. And I think what we therefore need to focus in the future on are equipping believers in the churches to be courageous and confident in speaking of Christ, all words beginning with C, courage, confidence, Christ, but also to be creative in trying to engage with people where they are, meet them in their different locations. In Monmouth again, they had a talk in World Women's Week, but related to how Jesus viewed women, and that brought a number of women in as well. A local author writing on books that have influenced my life, ultimately speaking about the scriptures. Some of these were held in local cafes, and so it was a very fresh approach which that congregation loved and wants to repeat and build on next year. I would hope that more initiatives like that could take place in Wales in the years to come. Well, first of all, the believers in the church have to be confident in the gospel. I think as you look at the New Testament, as people proclaimed and received the gospel, there were three responses that gave them a deep level of confidence and conviction about the gospel, that it had to be proclaimed. They were that the gospel is true and defensible. Believing in it doesn't require a leap of faith against the evidence. So the truth claims of the gospel are imperative, and it's very important that congregation members come to a settled conviction that the gospel was rooted in history. There's evidence for the existence of Jesus, for the deity of Jesus, for the resurrection of Jesus, which should give us confidence and courage to speak about him. Secondly, a healthy church, by and large, has the majority of members who are equipped to be able to provide honest answers to their friends' honest questions. And that's where the leadership team in the church, including the pastor, has a very important role in equipping members to have confidence in the gospel in order to proclaim it and provide answers to their friends about the question of suffering, for example, or the uniqueness of Jesus. I think the second dimension is not just the truth claims of the gospel, but that the gospel is powerful, and through it that individuals' lives are changed. And for that to happen, we need to see people within the congregation who are converted and have a delight in the gospel. The third dimension, which really fires people, is a sense that the gospel is wonderful and the most wonderful message in history. When you have these three dimensions in the life of the congregation, the conviction it's true, it's powerful, and it's wonderful, those people are unstoppable. When the leadership of the church equips them to be able to answer questions and bear witness to Christ, that ups the confidence level again. Then for the church to be fruitful, it seems to me, there's nothing wrong with developing a strategy for connecting with people within society, within the culture. Wales is a very community-orientated nation. So it's, in the past, life often was organised around the community of the chapel. That's not the case now. But the chapel has to find, or the church has to find, a means of building a sense of attractive community life where all comers are welcomed, and as part of the welcome, they hear of the truth and the relevance of the gospel and the biblical worldview. And some of the more effective churches in Wales, therefore, are engaged in things like advising people regarding debt collection, or mental health issues, or issues related to stress, or providing food banks for the poor, and so on. But congregations that are involved in the local communities where there are particular needs. Usually when that happens over a period of time, unbelievers in the town are attracted to the church. They start to speak well of it and respect it. And then when there are maybe special opportunities, it's a means of drawing people in to hear a more direct presentation of the gospel. It seems to me in the early church you have these two dimensions or three dimensions of straightforward public proclamation and gossiping of the gospel by individuals, the building of an attractive community which drew people in, and those things together seem to provide for fruitful gospel impact in a locality. one, the church leadership has to grasp the nettle of equipping the saints for works of service and for gossiping the gospel. One of the major reasons that believers don't share their faith is because deep down they're either not clear about it or just speak in jargonized theological and doctrinal terms, and they need help to speak the gospel in ordinary, understandable language to their friends. And two, often they just feel they're tongue-tied. If somebody asks them a tricky question like, where's God in the midst of suffering? They don't know how to answer it. So it is really important to have evangelistic preaching, which is powerful and engaging from the leadership of the church. But in the New Testament, you had these three things actually. You had the public proclamation of the gospel. You had meetings in small groups in homes, because there weren't any church buildings for the first 300 years. So that highlights the value of small groups where you can deal with people's questions in a gentle way. The church leadership needs to equip their members in order to put on good small groups which are reaching out to seekers or interested people. And thirdly, gossiping the gospel by everybody in the church. If you read the Acts of the Apostles, you have different Greek words for preaching and gossiping or chatting about the gospel. And most churches that grow have those things at the same time. Preaching is central, but it's not enough on its own. The fruitfulness is often determined by the number of ordinary church members who are gossipers of the gospel. So the leaders of the church have to both equip their believers to answer questions and have to communicate the truth of the gospel in their preaching and their teaching so that people are captivated by the truth, the power, and the wonder of the gospel, because that motivates people for the long haul. And what really motivates people is when they're convinced it's true, it's powerful, and it's wonderful. Then I think it's the role of the church to ask the question, what are all the various means by which we can connect with people in our culture? Community is very strong, and so the church has to build an attractive community. In many of our communities in Wales, they're broken. There are lots of social problems. And if the church can seek to address these by providing a caring, inviting community who, for example, seek to minister to those whose marriages are in difficulties or have huge problems with debt, handling money, needing food from a food bank, these kind of ways of connecting with people where they are, often that will attract people into the life of the community. So there needs to be the proclamation, the community life, the equipping of the saints, and then there need to be attractive opportunities for people to come and hear the gospel on a regular basis. It could be either through a seekers discussion group, or through the preaching on Sunday, or through set piece mission weeks or missions over a period of time, alongside, if possible, some meetings in neutral venues, inviting a Christian with a sports background to share his testimony, for example, in a sports centre, or other means of meeting neutrally in a local cafe with a Christian musician and a talk or something like that. But trying to find ways of connecting with people in society who are not used to crossing the threshold into the church. I think the overarching principle from Paul is, by all means possible, connect with people. So we have to be courageous, Christ-centered, but also creative in dialoguing about how we can reach different areas of the culture and society. They did a very interesting experiment in Monmouth earlier this year, excuse me, where they tried to analyze the various cultural groupings in the town and decided to hold meetings which targeted each of those groupings. There was an art group in town, so they had something related to art and the Bible. There were a lot of people interested in music, so they had a musician come in and sing. There was the World Women's Day, so they had something in the middle of that. There's a big interest in flowers and gardens there, so they invited someone who was working in Kew Gardens to come and speak there on one occasion. So they were trying to target those groupings and then invite people into the church from that initial targeting. And I think that shows creativity, both in approach and in the leadership. I think we have to use all these various means to connect with people and communicate the gospel by all means possible.